Um, Next to the podium, we have Martin Hartberg, Advocacy, Information and Protection Advisor for the Middle East, covering the Syria response at NRC. Martin will update us on the situation in Syria, the effects in Europe, and the work of NRC in the field. Welcome, Martin.
I actually have a slide with a few pictures that I wanted to show if I can get this to work. But if not, yeah. Okay. So I'll just leave that showing. It's going to show some pictures of the areas where the Norwegian Refugee Council is working. But thank you very much for inviting me to come to Iceland. You may be surprised to know that actually the scene you're seeing outside is not that dissimilar in terms of the weather that we're currently seeing in Lebanon. Although, of course, the kinds of warm buildings and the beautiful heated hotel I'm staying in is slightly different from the accommodation which the absolute majority of refugees are currently staying in. But I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, to say a little bit about the Norwegian Refugee Council itself. So we're a non-governmental organization. We're an aid agency that operates across the world, but we have some of our largest programs in the Middle East. We're working in each one of the major refugee hosting countries, in addition to also contexts such as Palestine, Yemen and Iraq, which tend to be more forgotten these days in the context of the large crisis in Syria at the moment. We work in a variety of sectors. We're providing education to thousands and thousands of children. We're working on shelter issues to provide accommodation for those who need it. We're also looking at issues of legal assistance to help people obtain legal documentation. And I'll explain a little bit about why that's important, a topic which may seem very dull or unsexy in the context of humanitarian response, but is actually extremely important for the basics of everyday life. So that's a little bit about the Norwegian Refugee Council. I think for me, one of the shocks is coming from the Middle East and arriving into Europe and seeing the debates around refugees and asylum seekers here across Europe. The utter panic, I think, is probably the only word that you see in some of the media and in the press around the, I think, approximately 1 million asylum seekers that came in the past year has been extremely interesting to follow in the context of a region which is seeing more than 4.2 million refugees being hosted by often much smaller countries than the large countries in Europe, and definitely much poorer countries. So that contrast has been extremely interesting. I think the kinds of policies we're seeing being put in place, which are trying to deal with this crisis, are also extremely interesting and often, from my perspective, very sad. So we see the increasing call for closed borders, even the call to have a rollback of the 1951 Refugee Convention, etc. And I want to explain a little bit about why I don't think those policies can work. And I think one illustrative example of why that's the case is that even after a lot of those measures have been implemented, we are seeing latest survey information data which comes through the UN and others, which show that there is approximately 25% of the refugee population, so that's over 1 million people, that say they have no choice and intend to, they really would like to and need to, flee to either to go back to Syria, given the war situation there that says how desperate it is for those refugees who are living outside of Syria right now, but to the vast, vast majority of them, they are still willing to take that risk to come to Europe. And whether that's by boat or by other means, they feel they have no choice but to do so. And I want to talk a little bit about why that's the case. And I think the number one reason why we are seeing that this is still the case, why so many people need to be fleeing right now, is the loss of hope. So we've seen some progress in terms of around the peace process, so the Vienna talks and lots of discussions around this, but very few people believe it's going to lead to certainly no immediate results, and it will take a long, long time, even if you do get a peace process in place, before the conditions in Syria will be anywhere near ready for anybody to be able to return. And this loss of hope, we're now approaching, come March, 5 years since the initial problems in Syria began. After 5 years, people are facing a very desperate situation, and therefore they're forced to leave. Now, for the people inside of Syria itself, of course, you've seen some of the figures, I'm sure, throughout the news, but you're seeing to the extent that during the course of this lecture, if you're looking at the average figures of the numbers of people displaced, you would have more than 400 people that may be displaced in Syria during the next hour and a half or so, based on the averages that you've seen over the past 5 years. So that gives you an extent of the daily situation, the hourly situation that people are facing in Syria itself. I think you've seen some of the footage of some of the besieged, so-called besieged communities. Now, what does it mean to be besieged? It means, in some cases, forced starvation policies being implemented on them. It means people without access to any kind of assistance. It means aid agencies like the Norwegian Refugee Council cannot access them. We cannot get to them to provide any assistance. And they cannot leave. They cannot get out. They cannot provide any, they cannot get to any kind of protection or assistance which they require. For us as aid agencies, we face enormous challenges trying to operate in a context like Syria. We've had approximately 81 aid workers from all agencies who've been killed in the past couple of years as a result of the fighting. So the largest problem we face is the ongoing insecurity, ongoing fighting going on the ground, which means we cannot get to many parts of the country. There's almost 4 million people who are in areas which are so-called hard-to-reach locations, and that means it's almost impossible for us to get near them and to provide assistance. Of course, ideally, we wouldn't need to be going to provide assistance to people. It should be people that can get to assistance themselves. But for us to operate and to get there is getting increasingly difficult. We also face a number of administrative barriers from various governments across the region, which make it extremely difficult for us to get permissions to get our staff in and out of the areas they need to get to work with local Syrian organizations who are doing the majority of the actual work on the ground, given the insecurity that international aid workers are facing. And we face barriers in terms of trying to get some of the funding and money to the right agencies and the right people in the right locations to come through. So the challenges we face are huge and only getting bigger. And without any kind of assistance, people of course then have therefore no choice but to try and flee to locations where they can get greater assistance. So of course what we've seen over the past 5 years or so is now we have, as was mentioned previously, more than 4 million refugees who've gone to Syria's neighbours. As I said, these are in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, also in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and some in Egypt and other countries as well. Now the situation there has been dire not just for the refugee population, but of course for local people who are hosting them. So there are a number of factors, so things like increase in rental prices, problems around finding accommodation for everybody, some increase in other prices, competition for particularly low-wage labour, etc. So this is having an impact obviously on local economies. But as a result of that impact, what we've seen is governments who are hosting the majority of refugees imposing a series of new deliberate policies to try and reduce the numbers of refugees on their territory. Now, what does this mean in practice? It means the first measure is to copy the response from Europe and to say those who are fleeing some of the most desperate situations in Syria will not be allowed to cross any longer, with a few exceptions, into the countries which are neighbouring Syria itself. So we're seeing build-up of internally displaced people who really need to escape, really need to get out of where the fighting is in Syria, but cannot do so. They are trapped, effectively. You're also seeing other policies where, effectively now, the majority of refugees who have fled previously, who have made it to neighbouring countries, are no longer legal under national law. They don't have the paperwork which is required, the residency permits which are required in order to stay there. So in the context of Lebanon, this is up to now 70% of refugees face a situation of limited legal status. And also a large number of people in Jordan, almost 300,000 people, are facing similar difficulties of maintaining a legal status. Now, what does this mean in practice? It's, in theory, this piece of paper, which is your registration with the local authorities, or an ID card, or a service card, as it's called in the context of Jordan, seems like a pretty dull bit of bureaucracy. But in practice, this is your lifeline. This is the difference between sending a kid to school or not, between accessing a hospital or not being able to. It's the difference between being able to move around freely or being stopped at a checkpoint and risk being either sent home, arrested, detained, etc. So the kinds of locations, some of the places which I was talking about, which are currently snowing in now, there are people who would say previously they were able to find perhaps a little bit of very low-paid manual labour. Perhaps they could access a local hospital if they could find the money to go do so in the private context of Lebanon. But now, because they don't have the paperwork in place, they can't pass a checkpoint. And if they can't pass a checkpoint, those services are out of reach. So these people are saying actually their whole life now is dependent on whether or not someone will spot them, someone will be able to renew this little piece of paper which they have in front of them. Which means that the type of assistance they're asking for has changed from people asking for greater shelter, greater access to work, etc., to many people saying, can you teach us some basic first aid because we can't get to the hospital any longer and we have this number of sick people in the area where we're living. So the situation of legal status is becoming increasingly difficult. situation of education is extremely difficult. So over half of the refugee population, the refugee children, are not able to go to school. Even before the crisis in many countries, so that's the Kurdistan region of Iraq and Lebanon, many of the public schools were already operating on double shifts. But with a huge increase in number of children coming through, there is simply not enough space. There's simply not enough money, not enough teachers to send children to school. But even more than that, many children, many parents, because they themselves cannot work, because they themselves do not have any money to pay for rent, to pay for food, to pay for the basics, they're forced to send their children to work. Or they're forced, in the case of daughters, to make them marry early. And this is mainly driven by economic factors. So as a result of this, you are having the so-called lost generation. The future of Syria is looking even more dire, given that you have so many people who are outside of education. And a particular group within that is perhaps the older kids, the so-called youth. We have a lot of debates that we're seeing across, whether it's in Europe, internationally, through the Security Council, etc., where young Arabs, Arab youth, are seen almost entirely in a negative light. They are seen, people, many of you who are similar ages to people who go to this university, who are all seen as, whether it's potential terrorists, potential radicals, potential troublemakers, rather than people who are actually going to be the ones who are going to rebuild Syria. They're going to be the future of Syria. And yet, whether it's the assistance, the programming, the support available to them, is simply not a priority for anybody. It's simply viewed from a negative perspective. So one of the things that the Norwegian Refugee Council and many other aid agencies is trying to do is to say, look, actually, we do need to be working with young people. We do need to work with kids. And we do need to find forms of education which are perhaps outside of the formal system until the formal system has the capacity to be able to absorb these people. So certainly for us, education is a huge, huge issue, whether it's for young people, but also for older people. Just to give you an example of the Syrian refugees that come to Jordan, more than half of those young people that came were attending university when they were in Syria. So these are people that are not dissimilar to us. Yeah. And suddenly they find themselves in a situation where they are without a prospect of a job, where their house has been destroyed, where they have no future other than a very dire one and a bleak one, and therefore forced to make the choice of whether to live in absolute dire poverty, perhaps forced to even return to Syria because things are so desperate, or to risk the trip to Europe. And the last thing to say is around the issue of livelihoods and income. So as I mentioned, you have rising prices, you have cuts in assistance, so you have huge numbers of people who are not receiving the same amount of aid from the UN and from aid agencies as did previously, as a result of an increase in the number of people requiring assistance and a relative decrease in the amount of money and assistance available coming in. As a result of that, also 5 years into a conflict, people, of course, are fed up. They do not want to have money coming in. They don't want a handout. Many of them are highly educated. Many of them have professions which are extremely useful, not just in the areas which they came from for in Syria, but also potentially for neighboring countries as well. They want to be able to work. They want to earn an income. They want to be able to do something during their day. And so one of the most important things that we're trying to work with and trying to encourage and find ways to support is to say, look, how can we make sure that now 5 years into a crisis, where humanitarian funding, the short-term emergency stuff is becoming more and more difficult, we need something that's going to last. We need something that's going to survive a little bit longer. And one of those things is, of course, integrating or finding ways to allow people to earn some form of income themselves. So livelihoods is extremely, extremely important. Of course, with the pressures that economies are facing, there's a lot of backlash. As there is in Europe, people say we don't want people stealing our jobs. But the reality is actually there are a whole number of economic arguments. And I'm not an expert on this, but if you would talk to economic experts within the UNDP or within the World Bank, they will tell you that there are huge numbers of sectors where, whether it's in Europe or in refugee-hosting countries in the Middle East, where refugees have the skills to fill very real gaps in the economy. They have the potential to be able to contribute, whether it's through taxation or through skill sets or through providing simply teaching for their own children and to be allowed to do so, ways they can contribute to society and contribute to the countries which they're in. And this is what we want to push for. This is what we, together with many other agencies, are now saying has to be the case. We are calling for, much like after the aftermath of the Second World War, although the context in Syria, of course, is extremely different and the war is ongoing, a Marshall Plan scale of response. The crisis is so large, it's so big, that the scale of response that's required has to also be huge. And that needs to be on the scale of the Marshall Plan. But what we want this to be is some kind of deal and agreement. This cannot just be short-term assistance. It can't just be the handouts that get to people. It needs to be much, much bigger. It needs to be huge development investment, huge longer-term investment, whether that's in infrastructure for states, whether that's in the state budgets, but also for the refugee populations to be allowed to work and for the refugee population to be allowed to be part of economic life and to be able to generate some income for themselves as well. And so what we want to do is, for us, we are pushing for a deal, a new deal for the Middle East, for refugee hosting countries, where Western countries, rich governments, provide a huge new form of investment that goes in. And in exchange, we ask that governments change their policies to allow people to stay legally and to allow people to access parts of the economy. And this is in everybody's interest. This is the interest of us, it's the interest of the refugees themselves, most importantly, and this is in the interest of refugee hosting countries. So that's one area where we think that we can see some changes. But there are also other areas too. We are seeing one of the reasons why we see so many people making a desperate choice to come to Europe is because there is no formalized routes in order to do so. And unless we increase those formalized routes, unless there are ways that more numbers of people can access organized, systematic processes to facilitate those routes, they will continue to come in very informal, very dangerous paths to Europe. Many people use the way illegal routes, but actually, according to the Refugee Convention and according to human rights law, there is no such thing as an illegal route for an asylum seeker to seek safety abroad. They have the right to do so, but they certainly can do so in much safer conditions than they currently are doing at the moment. So I think I'll leave it there in terms of some of the issues, and perhaps if there are any questions about some of this, then we can have a little bit of a conversation in addition to presentation. But thank you very much.